Hello economic students. So in this video we're putting the aggregate demand curve and the aggregate supply curve together, and it's going to really help us to understand what's going to happen in the macroeconomy given a change in one of those AD factors that we've learned before or one of those AS factors. Now just remember that this is no longer in the study design, so you will never get asked to draw an aggregate demand or aggregate supply curve. But it will absolutely help you to answer a lot of questions that come up on your second SAC and the exam. So let me show you why. Firstly, we use the aggregate demand and aggregate supply models and the shifting of those models to make predictions about what's going to happen in the macroeconomy. And that means we can work out, given a change in AD or AS, what's likely to happen to the average price level or our inflation goal, what's likely to happen to real GDP or our strong and sustainable economic growth goal, or what's likely to happen to the amount of jobs in the economy, what happens to our full employment goal. So it helps us to understand all three goals, and let's have a look on the demand and supply curve. Firstly, the aggregate demand curve is curved. Don't worry about that. The aggregate supply curve is important that it's curved because we have this kind of imaginary line running down here, and that shows us the total output of the economy, the maximum we can possibly produce given the resources in our economy. So it's basically anywhere on the PPF, if you remember, anywhere on this PPF or production possibility frontier. The problem is that in the real world, it's really hard to operate near your maximum output or productive efficiency, because as you get close to that capacity, shortages start to arise. It's hard to attract labor to certain businesses, and if you want to do that, you've got to pay more. It's hard to get materials, and if we need materials, we've got to pay more. And so we can see this on the curve here, right? It starts out when you're a long way away from capacity. It starts out relatively elastic because we can produce more without any sort of shortages and price pressures occurring. As we get closer to capacity, it starts to sort of turn inelastic here, doesn't it? It's quite steep. And the reason for that is we're getting close to capacity and there's no more resources available. But what absolutely happens, or there's a shortage of resources, is prices rise. So there's a large change in the average price level for not much increase in real GDP. Okay, so that's important when we start to talk about what the impact might be on our inflation goal, for example. All right, so let's just remember that on the the y-axis here, this basically shows us the average price level, or what will eventually become our inflation goal. The other equilibrium point here is our real GDP, and we can see once we shift, we can either increase real GDP or decrease real GDP. And not only does it tell us what's happening to real GDP, but it also will tell us what happens to the demand for labour. Because if you think to the circular flow model, whenever a firm produces that top flow from the business to the household, they also require labour from households in order to do that. So if we increase production, there's going to be more jobs in the economy. And that's our strong and sustainable economic growth goal, or our full employment goal. So this helps us to understand all of those three really important concepts. So let's look at it when there's something changing in the economy. Firstly, if there's a shift in the aggregate demand curve, there's a change in one of our AD factors. Maybe there is a depreciation in the Australian dollar. Okay. The first thing that happens is the curve shifts to the right, just like in microeconomics, and you can see that that's going to put some pressure on prices in the economy. But mostly we're going to get an increase in real GDP, again, because firms will respond to that increase in spending. That could also be explained via an expansion along the AS curve, but you really don't need to do that. The trick here is that there's still plenty of capacity in the economy. So if we think back to the PPF, we actually would have been operating somewhere inside the PPF. But as we move closer to the frontier or the curve, in this next slide here, we're going to see that a problem starts to occur. So as we get closer to that imaginary productive capacity, remember that imaginary productive capacity down here, as the economy starts to operate closer towards that, what happens is prices rise quite quickly because there's shortages, and that drives up the prices in our resource markets, but we can't produce much more. Okay, so this is a bad scenario. We don't want to get too close to our capacity because all that happens is we get inflation and not much increase in production, and therefore not much increase in jobs. Okay, so that's bad for living standards, right? Prices go up, but there's no more production and no more jobs. So what we need to do is try and find a way to improve the capacity of the economy or shift the aggregate supply outwards. So if I continue on this PPF analogy or relationship, that would shift the whole PPF curve this way if we were to shift the aggregate supply curve. And you can see that this is the best scenario. Maybe there's an increase in the amount of labour in Australia, the quantity, immigration policy, or maybe there's an improvement in the quality of labour and productivity, or an improvement in technology, or whatever, decrease in cost of production. What this does is put downward pressure on the average price level or downward pressure on inflation, but at the same time we've got an increase in real GDP. So this is the best scenario, okay? Remember, we're going to use these sort of on the side of our page or on a scrap piece of paper to help us understand what happens in the macroeconomy, but we don't need to draw them, so don't stress too much about them. All right, bye for now.